The artillery position is here, just past the ridge. We approach from the south.
What about the patrol near the river?
Snow blanketed the Ardennes like a funeral shroud, thick, silent, and merciless. It was just past dawn, December 17th, 1944, and the forest breathed frost into the gray sky. In the distance, a low growl echoed through the trees, like thunder rolling beneath the earth. But this wasn't a storm. It was steel. The first Panzer Mark IV emerged from the fog like a prehistoric beast, its iron skin gleaming beneath a veil of snow. Its treads crushed branches, churned frozen mud, and left deep black scars across the pristine white. Behind it, more followed, 5, maybe 6, each rumbling with the kind of arrogant weight that said, "We are unstoppable." Inside one of the tanks, a German crewman adjusted his gloves, yawned, and lit a cigarette. Another hummed softly, tapping the side of the barrel with a coin. They were relaxed, confident. No resistance had held them this deep into the Ardennes. The enemy, they believed, was running out of breath and ideas. Then came the sound, a click, so faint it might have been mistaken for the crack of a twig. Then a blast. Not a distant explosion, but a shock wave that threw snow and steel skyward in a column of smoke and fire. The lead tank's belly erupted, blown open from beneath. A twisted, blackened sheet of armor flipped into the air like a coin tossed by giants. Flames licked upward, hungry and bright. One of the trailing Panzers lurched, its driver slamming the brakes as fire engulfed the path ahead. Another tank reversed hastily, only to trigger a second explosion. Metal screamed, snow melted in a ring of hellish orange, and suddenly the invincible line began to collapse on itself. Commanders barked orders, but there was panic in their eyes. No one had reported mines here. No Allied engineers were thought to be nearby. No scouts had warned of traps. And yet, here they were, dying. One German officer stumbled from the hatch of a burning Panzer, his face streaked with blood and soot. He looked back at the wreckage, then down at the smoldering crater where the blast had originated. There, poking out from the snow like the jagged tooth of some buried predator, was a curved piece of steel, sharpened, scorched, and unmistakably forged by hand. Not factory-made, not military issue. A plow blade. The officer stared, confused as the flames danced across the snow. This wasn't war as he knew it. This was something else. Something older, more primal, as if the land itself had decided it had had enough and had reached into its past to strike back. By mid-morning, 6 German tanks lay crippled across the trail. 3 more had turned back. Recon units found nothing but snow, empty tree lines, and faint boot prints leading to an abandoned forge on the edge of the village. There were no medals waiting for the man who built those devices, no press release, no name on a radio bulletin, only silence. And in that silence, far from the battlefield, in a dim workshop where the smell of ash and iron never quite faded, a single hammer rested beside a cold anvil. Because the war had come, and a blacksmith had answered. The forge sat at the edge of the village, where the dirt road gave way to forest. Its stone chimney, tall and blackened by decades of soot, exhaled a faint ribbon of smoke into the pale morning sky. The anvil was warm. The hammer was already moving. Emile Van Houtte struck the iron with steady rhythmic blows. Clang, clang, pause, turn, clang. He wasn't making weapons. Not today. Just reshaping a broken horseshoe for a farmer who had left 2 chickens as payment. That was how things worked now. Coins were rare, but favors lasted longer. At 58, Emile moved like a man who had spent his entire life listening to metal. Not just hearing it, but understanding it. He had broad shoulders, worn hands, and a face carved by firelight and solitude. Deep lines ran from the corners of his eyes, but they weren't sadness, just memory. The inside of his workshop was more shrine than workspace. Tools hung in perfect rows. The old bellows creaked like a grandfather's cough. In the corner sat a small rocking chair, untouched, draped with a faded shawl. Next to it, a photo of a woman and a baby, both smiling, framed in cracked wood. Emile never touched that chair. Outside, the village of Rochefort stirred beneath the frost. Smoke rose from a handful of chimneys. Children's laughter echoed faintly from a schoolhouse, still pretending there was peace. Most of the men were gone, called to war, killed or missing. Those who remained moved with the quiet pace of survivors. Jacques darted into the forge without knocking, 17, full of nerve and elbows, his boots crunching over the frozen dirt. "Morning, Emile." Emile didn't look up. He nodded once and continued hammering. Jacques watched him work for a moment. Then, as always, he talked. "Did you hear what happened in Saint-Hubert? They say the Panzers rolled straight through. Not a single Allied unit stopped them. They flattened 2 villages in under a day." Clang. "You think they'll come this way?" Clang. Jacques exhaled, agitated. "You don't say much, do you?" "I say what matters," Emile replied without missing a beat. Jacques walked over to the fire, rubbing his hands. "You ever fight, Emile? Back in the last war?" "No," Emile said, then added, "Yes, not like this." Jacques tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Emile stopped hammering. He looked at the glowing horseshoe, then dropped it into the quench with a hiss. Steam rose like ghosts. "I fought to keep my name. That was enough." It was quiet for a moment. Jacques frowned, unsure what that meant, but sensed it wasn't the time to ask. "You should leave," Emile said. "Leave? Soon. This place won't be safe." "I'm not running." "It's not running. It's surviving. There's a difference." Jacques shook his head. "You sound like my mother." Emile gave the faintest smile. "She's a smart woman." Outside, a truck rumbled down the road, a British supply vehicle, one of the few that still made rounds to the outlying villages. Its tires kicked up slush and gravel. Jacques ran to the door and watched it pass. "We're not ready for them," he said. "Not for the tanks. Not for what's coming." Emile didn't respond. He turned back to the forge, picked up the hammer, and resumed his rhythm. Clang, clang, pause, turn. Jacques lingered for another minute, as if waiting for some secret plan to be revealed. When nothing came, he left. Emile worked in silence until the sun was high. When the fire finally died down, he placed the finished horseshoe on the bench and walked to the corner of the room. He stood in front of the rocking chair. His hand hovered over the shawl. Then he turned away and left the forge. The anvil stayed warm, but the room felt cold. Night fell early in December, swallowing the village in layers of quiet. Frost clung to the windows like breath held too long. Emile sat at his small kitchen table, lit only by the orange glow of the stove. In front of him, a chipped ceramic bowl of stew sat untouched. He wasn't hungry. His eyes drifted to the far wall, where a nail held a small iron key. He stared at it for a long while, unmoving, as if the key might speak if he waited long enough. A knock broke the silence. Jacques stood at the door again, this time with a wool scarf wrapped tight around his neck. "Sorry," he said. "I thought maybe you'd want to hear the broadcast." Emile didn't answer, but stepped aside and let the boy in. They sat beside the old wireless radio. Its wooden casing cracked at the corners. Static buzzed through the speakers as Jacques adjusted the dial. Heavy movement reported through Luxembourg. Armored divisions confirmed. Allied positions falling back to secondary lines. The voice was clipped, British trying hard not to sound panicked. Jacques swallowed hard. They're coming. Emile said nothing. He stared at the embers in the stove, remembering a different night, a different war. 1914, Dinant. He was a boy then, barely 15, watching German soldiers march through the square with perfect boots and blank expressions. His father, Léon, had refused to leave his forge. "This is our home," he had said, "our tools, our fire, our name." They took him anyway. Later, Emile found the hammer his father used, shattered in two, not from use, but from rage. Someone had broken it across the anvil before leaving. A message. Emile never forgot that sound. The next year, he apprenticed with his uncle across the river, never speaking of his father again. He learned to shape steel without speaking, to listen for what the fire whispered when no one else was listening. When he met Elise, she told him he smelled like rain and iron. She made him laugh. That was her superpower. She had hands made for stitching, not war. Their son lived for 3 days. Elise never cried in front of Emile, but he heard her in the dark, curled beneath that same shawl now resting on the rocking chair. When she got sick during the last epidemic, she asked only one thing: "Don't let war take you too." He promised. That promise had held for over 20 years. Now Jacques was in his kitchen, a war on his heels, and the smell of fuel and engines creeping over the hills. Outside, a low, unfamiliar vibration stirred the air. Not thunder. Tracks. Heavy ones. Jacques heard it too. He froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Is that?" Emile stood, walked to the door, opened it. In the distance, maybe 2 kilometers off, glowing lights pierced the tree line. Dim but moving. An engine growled, guttural and foreign. Not a supply truck. Not a civilian car. Panzer. Jacques whispered, "They're scouting the route." Emile didn't respond. He walked to the wall, reached up, and took the iron key from its nail. Jacques tilted his head. "What's that open?" Emile turned the key in his fingers, slowly. "The old cellar," he said. "Haven't used it in years." "Why now?" Emile looked at the boy, not harshly, not kindly, just directly. "Because this time," he said, "they'll not take my fire." The year was 1914 and the world was breaking apart like overworked steel. Emile was 15 when the Germans marched into Dinant. The village had heard rumors for weeks, whispers of invasion, soldiers on bicycles, machine guns hidden under hay carts. But nothing prepared them for the sight of hundreds of boots striking cobblestone in unison. The air changed that day. It felt heavier, like it had absorbed too much smoke to breathe. Emile Van Houtte, Emile's father, stood in front of their forge with soot-streaked arms crossed and jaw clenched. He didn't move as the soldiers passed. He didn't flinch when an officer stopped, pointed at the anvil, and barked something in German. The officer wanted ammunition casings. Léon spat on the ground and said nothing. Within hours, they dragged him away. Emile watched, hidden behind the woodpile, his hands shaking. His mother screamed, begged, cursed the soldiers until they knocked her down. Emile tried to run to her, but an older neighbor held him back. "They'll take you too," she whispered. "Stay quiet." That night the forge was silent. The fire had died. The tools hung cold and useless, like bones from an abandoned body. In the morning, Emile found the hammer, his father's favorite, split clean down the handle, shattered across the anvil. Not from where. It had been broken deliberately. A message. Submit or be erased. His mother never recovered, not physically, not in spirit. She made Emile swear never to speak of that day again. And he didn't. Not for years. Instead, he worked. By 16, Emile had crossed the river to apprentice with his uncle. The forge there was small, tucked behind a wind-warped barn, but it was enough. His uncle didn't talk much, didn't need to. They communicated in iron. Emile learned the weight of silence, how metal sings when it's ready, how fire listens when stoked right. Then came Elise. She arrived in the village with a traveling nurse unit in 1918. Pale, with wild curls, always threatening to escape her scarf, she stitched wounds by day and read banned poetry at night. Emile met her when she brought in a shattered wheel from an ambulance cart. He offered to fix it in an hour. She laughed and said, "Show off." He did it in 40 minutes. She returned 3 days later with a rusted kettle, then a broken lantern, then no reason at all. They were married in the spring. The war ended 2 weeks later. It should have been the beginning, but the years weren't kind. Their son was born too early, lungs too weak. He lived only long enough to be named Mathieu. Emile buried him beneath the apple tree behind the forge and marked the grave with a stone carved by hand. Elise never spoke his name aloud again, but sometimes Emile would find her sitting near the tree, humming lullabies to the wind. Illness came quietly. First a cough, then fever, then the look in her eyes that told Emile she already knew. The doctor called it galloping consumption. They tried herbs, warm blankets, prayer. Nothing held. On her final night, Elise took Emile's hand and whispered, "The fire inside you is bigger than this war, than this pain. But promise me, don't let war take you again." He promised. After she passed, Emile covered the rocking chair with her shawl and never touched it again. The hammer hung untouched for a year. The forge grew cold. He lived by fixing wagons, making hinges, shoeing mules, never anything for death. Not even when this new war began. But now the past knocked louder than ever. The Germans were back. Their boots were heavier, their tanks louder, their ideas crueler. And the fire inside Emile, buried for decades, was beginning to smolder again. This time it wasn't rage that lit it. It was memory. The cellar door groaned open with the weight of time. Rust flaked off the hinges like old scabs. Emile held the key in his hand for a long moment before turning it. Jacques stood behind him, silent now, unsure if he was supposed to follow. The entrance was tucked behind the forge, hidden beneath a patch of tangled ivy and warped planks. It hadn't been opened in over 2 decades. The air inside smelled of oil, earth, and memory. Emile lit a lantern and descended first. The light danced across the stone walls, revealing rows of shelves lined with tools wrapped in cloth, coils of wire, small barrels sealed with pitch. Everything was exactly where he'd left it, waiting, like the bones of a forgotten machine. In the center of the room stood a long, heavy wooden chest. He knelt beside it, ran a hand along the lid, and opened it slowly. Jacques leaned over his shoulder and gasped. Inside were 6 curved slabs of dark metal, each nearly 2 feet long, sharpened on one edge, notched on the other. Emile lifted one out with both hands. It was heavy, beautiful in its brutality. The blade of a plow, yes, but not the kind used for turning soil. This had been reforged, shaped to split something far less forgiving. "Is that farm equipment?" Jacques asked. "It was," Emile said. He set the blade on a nearby bench. Even in the dim light, its edge gleamed. "I started working on them after the First War. Just ideas, things no one asked for, things I hoped I'd never need." Jacques reached in and pulled out a second blade, struggling with the weight. "They're thick as armor. You forged all these by hand?" Emile nodded. "Steel from old train couplings, heated until they glowed white, tempered in oil, sharpened with stone." "But why?" Emile looked at him. "Because war doesn't always knock on the front door. Sometimes it crawls through the fields, dressed like progress, and you need something unexpected." They spent the next hour dusting off crates, unwrapping tools, clearing space on the workbench. Emile moved slowly, but with purpose. His hands remembered what his heart tried to forget. Jacques was everywhere, lifting, sorting, questioning. At one point he stopped and held up a thick iron rod. "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd used all this before?" Emile didn't answer. He was staring at the hammer. It hung on the far wall, untouched since Elise died. Its wooden grip had darkened with age. The head was worn smooth from years of work. He stepped forward, reached up, and took it down. It felt heavier than he remembered. Or maybe he had just grown older. He walked back to the bench and set a blade onto the anvil. The metal rang out, low and pure, a sound from another life. He gripped the hammer, then stopped. His hand shook. Jacques noticed. "You okay?" Emile didn't answer at first. The forge was warm now, the fire alive again. He stared into the flames, as if looking for something hidden in the coals. "I made a promise," he said quietly. Jacques waited. "To someone I loved, that I would never let war change me again." Jacques stepped closer. "And now," Emile closed his eyes. "Now I wonder if keeping that promise means letting everything else burn." The room was silent except for the soft crackle of fire and the weight of a lifetime pressing on the shoulders of an old man. Finally, Emile exhaled. He raised the hammer. The first strike was soft, more memory than motion. The second rang louder. By the third, the forge was singing again. Outside, snow began to fall. Captain Otto von Kruger stood at the edge of the clearing, boots deep in snow, binoculars raised to his eyes. The forest around him was still, unnaturally so. Not even the birds dared break the silence. The Panzer column behind him waited like a coiled fist. 6 tanks, 4 half-tracks, 24 infantry with rifles slung casually over their shoulders. To any outsider, it looked like a spear about to strike. But Kruger knew better. He knew something felt wrong. He lowered the binoculars and turned to his lieutenant, a young man with nervous eyes and a voice too soft for war. "The road curves sharply near that ridge," Kruger said, pointing. "No natural cover. It's a perfect place for an ambush." The lieutenant blinked. "But sir, this region was declared clear. No resistance recorded." Kruger's jaw tensed. "Resistance doesn't record itself." The younger man fell silent. Kruger had seen too much to be fooled by silence. He had marched through Poland, burned through France, and witnessed what happened when commanders believed the reports instead of the terrain. Reports lied. The ground didn't. He walked forward, snow crunching underfoot, and knelt beside a fallen tree. The bark was freshly broken, not by weather, by movement. Someone or something had dragged heavy metal across it recently. He rose slowly, brushing snow from his gloves. "There are no Allied tanks here," he said. "No planes, no artillery. So why does this place smell like a trap?" His question wasn't rhetorical. He was speaking to himself, out loud, because thinking aloud helped him hear what others ignored. One of the Panzer drivers revved the engine, impatient. Kruger turned. "Kill the engine." The man hesitated. Kruger stepped closer. "I said kill it." The engine sputtered and died. Silence returned. Kruger closed his eyes, listening. After a moment, he opened them and walked back toward the lead tank. He placed a hand on the thick armor, as if feeling for a heartbeat. "It's not the noise," he muttered. "It's the quiet." Back at camp the night before, Kruger had reviewed the maps personally. Rochefort was a small village, tactically insignificant, but it stood along a pass that led to several key rail junctions. The Allies would need it. So would they. Intel said the place was nearly abandoned. No soldiers, only peasants. But Kruger remembered Dinant in 1914. He had been a child then, just old enough to remember the sound of bells turning into screams. His father had commanded a unit that marched through the village. They expected surrender. Instead, they found traps, farms wired with explosives, old blacksmiths with gunpowder stashed beneath chicken coops. He had never forgotten the way his father described it. They didn't fight like soldiers. They fought like ghosts. Now in 1944, the ghosts felt close again. A corporal approached through the trees, saluting with a stiff arm. "Scouts returned, sir. No signs of Allied troops. Just civilians, farmers, a forge. Quiet." Kruger raised an eyebrow. "A forge?" "Yes, sir. Old, still active. Smoke from the chimney." Kruger thought for a moment. Then he smiled. But it wasn't a warm smile. "Send a team," he said. "No uniforms, make it look like looting. Burn the outer buildings. Leave the forge for now. I want to see who comes to defend it." The corporal hesitated. "If there are civilians," Kruger's smile faded, "then they'll learn what happens when civilians forget their place." He turned away, walking back toward his vehicle. Before stepping inside, he glanced at the forest once more. "It's never the big guns," he murmured. "It's the quiet men with fire in their hands." The smoke came before the screams. It rolled over the rooftops in thick, oily plumes, black against the pale morning sky. Emile stepped out of the forge and looked west, toward the outer edge of the village. He didn't need to ask what was burning. A barn, maybe two. He could smell hay, singed leather, and something worse, scorched meat, not cattle. People were running, women clutching children, older men hauling carts with shaking hands. Some cried, others just stared ahead, too numb for sound. Dogs barked, cows lowed, and above it all came the unmistakable roar of tank engines idling nearby. They weren't attacking the whole village, not yet, just pieces. Just enough to send a message. Jacques burst through the alley behind the forge, red-faced and breathless. "They're torching everything, stealing food, knocking down doors." One of them hit old Gerard with a rifle. He was just trying to move his wife. Emile said nothing. Jacques threw his hands in the air. "This is it. This is what you were waiting for, isn't it? Time to strike. We've got the blades, we've got the ground. Let's do something." Still, Emile didn't move. Jacques' voice cracked. "You said they'd come. You said you were ready." Emile turned back toward the forge, his expression unreadable. "Not yet." "Not yet? What the hell does that mean?" Jacques followed him inside, slamming the door behind them. "They're out there destroying everything, and you're in here shaping steel like it's just another winter." Emile picked up a pair of tongs and adjusted a piece of metal in the furnace. "I don't fight wars in rage," he said. "I fight them in rhythm." Jacques stepped closer, his hands shaking. "People are dying, Emile. And more will, if we move too soon." Jacques stared at him, chest heaving. The heat from the forge made the air waver between them like a veil. On one side, a boy who wanted to strike back. On the other, a man who had waited too long to throw a punch and lived to bury the consequence. "What are we even waiting for?" Jacques demanded. Emile didn't look up. "For them to believe we're broken." Jacques blinked. "They're arrogant," Emile continued. "They think this village is nothing. Let them. Let them grow comfortable. Let them spread themselves thin." He turned toward Jacques now, eyes steady. "Then we hit them where they least expect it, and we do it right." Jacques' voice dropped, almost a whisper. "You're afraid." Emile didn't flinch. "Afraid you'll lose the rest of yourself if you fight again," Jacques said. "Afraid you'll break that promise to her?" The silence after that was sharp. Emile looked away. Jacques shook his head. "You'd rather let them burn the village to the ground than admit that promise is already dead." The blow came not from a fist, but from a word that struck deeper than steel. Emile turned back to the fire, jaw tight. He pulled the blade from the furnace and laid it on the anvil. The metal was glowing red, alive, angry. "I buried a child," he said softly. "I buried a wife. I buried a father who believed silence was stronger than submission. Don't lecture me about fear." Jacques stood frozen. Emile raised the hammer. Each strike was heavier than the last. Sparks flew. The anvil sang like a church bell at a funeral. "I know what war does," Emile said between blows. "It doesn't just kill bodies. It eats memory. It takes everything soft inside you and burns it until you don't remember what love felt like." The last strike landed with a crack. He set the hammer down. Jacques' voice was smaller now. "So what do we do?" Emile didn't answer immediately. He picked up the blade and held it to the light. The edge was perfect. "We make every strike count," he said. "No wasted motion. No wasted lives." Outside, more smoke rose. But inside the forge, fire was becoming something else. Not destruction, preparation. Night wrapped the village in silence, but the forge pulsed like a beating heart. Inside, the fire blazed hotter than it had in years. Shadows danced across the stone walls as Emile moved from one workstation to another, his body steady, his hands sure. Jacques stood nearby, sweat already clinging to his brow despite the winter outside. The first blade was already on the anvil, thick, curved, and still glowing from the furnace. Emile turned it slowly with the tongs, inspecting every edge, every angle. This part, he said, pointing with the hammer, will face upward at 37 degrees. When the pressure from the tank hits the mine, the explosion will force this edge straight into the underbelly. Jacques watched, wide-eyed. It'll cut through the armor? If it doesn't cut, Emile said, it'll tear. He set the hammer down and reached for a rusted British anti-tank mine pulled from a hidden cache beneath the floor. Carefully, he unscrewed the bottom casing, revealing the core components: a pressure plate, a fuse, and a small block of TNT. I found this after a patrol dropped supplies 2 months ago, Emile explained. Useless in the snow. The plate doesn't press down evenly, and the tanks just glide over. Jacques leaned in. So you're modifying it? No, I'm giving it purpose. He placed the plow blade atop the mine housing and marked precise weld points with chalk. Then with slow, methodical care, he fired up the torch. Sparks flared. The room filled with a sharp hiss of metal bonding with metal. This isn't just about force, Emile said over the sound. It's about shape. A flat plate spreads the blast. A sharp edge concentrates it. Like a knife, not a hammer. Jacques grinned. You're turning farm tools into tank killers. Emile didn't smile. I'm turning silence into something that speaks. Hours passed like minutes. Outside, the distant thump of artillery echoed across the hills. Occasionally, the walls shook slightly, and dust fell from the ceiling. But neither of them stopped working. They completed the first prototype just after midnight. It was brutal, crude, elegant. A curved blade rising like a fin from a round steel base. It looked like something that didn't belong in any war, ancient and futuristic at once. Something forged by a people with no army, but endless resolve. They carried it to the cold chamber beside the forge, where Emile kept tools and components that couldn't survive the heat. He wrapped the blade in burlap and laid it gently on a cot made from old pallets. Jacques exhaled. How many can we make? 6, Emile said. Maybe 7. Depends on how long they give us. Jacques nodded. Then after a pause, he asked, what if none of them work? Emile looked at him. Then we die trying. He said it simply, not as a threat or a declaration, just a fact. The forge fell quiet again. Jacques sat down, wiping sweat from his brow with a dirty rag. Emile poured them each a mug of water from a metal canister. I used to dream of being a soldier, Jacques said, when I was younger. Emile raised an eyebrow. I thought it would mean something, Jacques continued. Courage, honor, making a difference. Emile stared into the fire. Soldiers don't make a difference. People do. Jacques frowned. What's the difference? Soldiers follow orders, Emile said. People make choices. Outside, snow had begun to fall again. Soft, slow flakes drifting through the darkness. Emile stood and walked to a wooden shelf along the far wall. He retrieved a worn leather pouch and untied the strings. Inside were a series of small brass medallions, each one etched with unfamiliar markings. He handed one to Jacques. What is it? The boy asked. A blessing, Emile said. From Elise's father. He was Romani, said the symbols protect from machines. Jacques turned it over in his hand. Do you believe that? Emile didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the finished weapon resting in the shadows. We're not fighting with what we have, he said. We're fighting with what we believe. And sometimes that had to be enough. The wind bit hard as they stepped into the night. Snow had thickened, falling in slow, steady curtains. It muffled sound, blurred outlines, made the world feel softer than it really was. But Emile and Jacques moved with urgency, their burlap-wrapped payloads tucked tightly beneath their coats. Each carried 3 devices, hand-forged blades welded to war-forged minds, held together by rope and willpower. Emile led the way, stepping carefully across frozen ground, his eyes fixed ahead. Jacques followed, quiet for once, every breath a cloud in the dark. The path curved west, through a grove of skeletal birch trees that bordered the main road. In daylight, it looked harmless. At night, it was a corridor of ghosts. They stopped beneath a fallen tree, its trunk angled like a makeshift barricade. "Here," Emile said. He knelt and brushed snow aside with gloved hands. Jacques did the same, moving quickly to clear a patch wide enough to reveal the frozen soil beneath. The earth was hard, uncooperative, but Emile had brought a small pickaxe, and with practiced rhythm, he broke through. When the hole was deep enough, he lowered the first mine inside. Jacques handed him the blade. With silent precision, Emile locked the curved steel into place above the pressure plate, angling it slightly toward the expected direction of the tank's tread. He packed snow around the edges, then stood. "One down," he said. They repeated the process 5 more times, each placement chosen for its natural choke point. Narrow bends, tree clusters, blind spots. Emile moved with the patience of a man who understood time differently. Jacques moved like someone afraid there wouldn't be enough of it. After the 4th mine, they heard something. Engines. Not close, but not far either. A low rumble rolling through the trees, steady as a heartbeat. Jacques froze, crouched beside a half-dug hole. His breath caught in his throat. Emile lifted a hand. "Wait." They stayed still for almost a minute. 2 minutes. Then the sound faded, turning east, not toward them. Jacques exhaled slowly. "That was close." Emile didn't reply. He just returned to digging. When the 6th mine was set, they stepped back and surveyed their work. To a passing eye, the road still looked untouched, only a few uneven patches in the snow, a slight discoloration here or there. But beneath the surface, it had changed. It was no longer a path for invaders. It was a line of warning, a whisper written in steel. Jacques stood beside Emile, rubbing his arms against the cold. "How will we know if they work?" Emile didn't look away from the trees. "We won't," he said. "But they will." The boy nodded, solemn. For a moment, neither of them moved. Snow clung to their shoulders, their boots, their hats. The wind howled through the branches above, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, a lonely, broken sound. Jacques broke the silence. "What happens if they find us before the tanks come?" Emile turned to him. "Then we make them believe this was all coincidence. Scattered junk, forgotten tools." Jacques tilted his head. "And if they don't believe us?" A pause. "Then we make them remember us." They started the walk back in silence. With each step, Emile felt the weight in his chest shift. Not fear exactly. Not hope either. Something colder, sharper, a feeling he hadn't let himself name since Elise died. Purpose. They reached the forge just before dawn. The sky was beginning to lighten, casting the snow in shades of blue and gray. Emile stepped inside first, lit the lantern, and hung his coat by the door. Jacques stayed outside a moment longer, staring back toward the woods. "Do you think anyone will ever know we did this?" he asked softly. Emile didn't answer. He didn't need to. Some things didn't need a witness, only an outcome. The cold had teeth that morning. It bit through wool, through leather, through the cracked knuckles of men who had known too many winters. Emile stood at the edge of the forge, hidden behind the door, watching the forest line to the east. His breath fogged the glass. The fire inside the forge was low now, banked coals barely alive. Everything else was waiting. Jacques sat beside the window, rifle across his knees. He hadn't said much since the night before. There were dark circles under his eyes, but his hands didn't shake. Not anymore. Then it came. Not the tanks. Not yet. First, the birds. They erupted from the trees like shrapnel, black against gray sky, wings beating the alarm only nature ever heeded. A moment later, the first sound reached human ears. A distant dull growl, like metal dragging its belly across the earth. Jacques looked up sharply. Emile didn't move. The ground began to hum, It wasn't loud, not yet, but it had weight, deep and heavy, like a drum roll beneath their boots. Then came the first visual. Through the trees, silhouettes emerged, thick-bodied, square-headed beasts crawling across the snow. Panzers, 6 of them. More than they had hoped for. More than they had planned for. Behind them followed half-tracks and infantry, spaced just far enough to feel invincible. Jacques whispered, "They're taking the main path." Emile nodded. "Just like we thought." The tanks slowed as they reached the narrow bend near the ridge, right where the 6th mine had been buried. The lead tank inched forward, its treads throwing up chunks of snow and ice. The crew had no reason to be cautious. No alerts. No scouts missing. No signs of traps. Why should there be? To them, this was a farming village. Insignificant. Emile clenched his jaw. The Panzer rolled directly over the kill zone and stopped. Nothing happened. Jacques held his breath. Then, a sharp metallic click. Then the world tore open. The explosion wasn't massive. It wasn't theatrical. It was focused, brutal, designed for one purpose. The underbelly of the tank erupted upward, shrapnel and flame jetting through the cabin. A split second later, the hatch flew open, followed by a scream and a plume of black smoke. The tank listed sideways, treads seizing. Chaos followed. The tanks behind it slammed brakes, their formations scattering slightly as soldiers shouted over one another. The 2nd Panzer tried to reverse, track spinning on ice. It didn't make it far. Another click. Another blast. This time the explosion was angled just enough to flip the vehicle onto its side. The 3rd tank veered off the path, but its right tread hit mine number 4. A third eruption. Metal howled. Snow turned black. From inside the forge, the shock waves could be felt. Small tremors rolling through the ground like angry prayers. Jacques stood frozen, mouth open. They're working." Emile didn't answer. He was watching through the glass, silent, his face stone. Outside, German infantry were scrambling now, trying to flank the destruction, moving toward the woods, toward where the mines weren't. They didn't realize the trap hadn't just been physical. It was psychological. The precision, the suddenness, it shook them more than a full ambush could have. These weren't wild partisans. This was something deliberate, something worse. The 5th tank tried to press forward, hoping to climb over the wreckage. Its front treads made it onto the chassis of the first destroyed vehicle. Before the pressure from the combined weight pushed the buried mine beneath even deeper. The detonation was delayed by a second, just enough to give hope. Then it vanished in flame. 5 tanks. Gone in under 5 minutes. One remained, engine growling, unsure whether to advance or retreat. The commander stuck his head out, eyes wide. He was young. He saw the wreckage ahead. He saw the smoke curling into the sky, and he gave the order. Retreat. The last Panzer turned slowly, cautiously, and began backing away, trailing heat, fear, and disbelief. Jacques turned to Emile. "We did it. They're leaving." But Emile's eyes were still on the forest. "Not yet," he said. And he was right, because something was still coming. The retreat was a lie. They never meant to leave. Within minutes of the last Panzer disappearing into the trees, the boots came. Black, fast, disciplined. German infantry flooded the village in squads of 5, sweeping alleys and back doors, rifles raised, voices barking orders that most villagers didn't understand and didn't need to. People ran, or hid, or froze. In the forge, Emile packed tools into the floor hatch beneath the anvil, moving with precision. He had done this before, long ago. The difference was, this time he wasn't hiding for himself. He was buying time. Jacques wasn't inside. He had gone out, said he'd help Mrs. Vautrin move her children to the cellar behind the chapel. "I'll be quick," he'd said. He wasn't. The first shot cracked the morning like thunder. Emile froze. A second shot followed, closer. He raced to the window. Down the street, Jacques was crouched beside a wooden cart, dragging a crying girl behind a pile of crates. A German soldier had his rifle aimed, shouting. Another advanced from the side, bayonet fixed. Emile didn't think. He grabbed the iron poker from the fire and stepped outside, boots thudding against the frozen earth. "Hey!" he barked. The soldier turned. Emile didn't stop. He charged, faster than a man his age should, rage and instinct overtaking the weight of years. The poker struck the side of the soldier's helmet with a sickening clang. The man crumpled. Emile didn't see if he got up. Another shout. Another gun. He spun, just as Jacques pulled the girl fully behind cover. Then the third soldier fired. The shot hit Jacques in the side, just below the ribs. His body jerked as he collapsed onto the snow, arms still outstretched, trying to shield the girl. Emile screamed. He ran to the boy, dropped to his knees and pressed his hands over the wound. Blood bubbled between his fingers, warm and shocking in the cold air. "Stay with me," he said. "Don't move." Jacques' eyes fluttered. He coughed, winced. "I'm okay," he lied. "No, you're not. Shut up and breathe." "Ano." Another soldier yelled behind them. Emile grabbed Jacques under the arms and dragged him behind a stack of hay bales. Bullets tore into the wood just inches from their heads. The little girl cried. Jacques was pale now. "I didn't want to die like this," he whispered. "You're not dying," Emile snapped. "I won't let you." Jacques gritted his teeth. "I just wanted to do something real." Emile looked at him, this stubborn, impulsive, brave boy. He pressed harder on the wound, his hands slick with red. "You did," he said. "You gave them fear." From the edge of the alley, another soldier approached. Emile reached for the poker again, but this time it wouldn't be enough. A gunshot rang out, but not from the alley, from the church tower. The German soldier dropped mid-step, a red flower blooming across his chest. Someone else was fighting now. A second shot, a third. More shouts. Resistance. Real resistance. Villagers, farmers, fathers, sons emerged from hiding, armed with stolen rifles, hunting gear, even kitchen knives. The Germans were caught between the mines behind them and a village that refused to die in silence. It wasn't an army, but it was enough. The tide turned. Within minutes, the Germans retreated, this time for real, dragging their wounded, their pride bleeding in the snow. Emile held Jacques tightly as the world slowed around them. "You're going to be all right," he murmured. "I promise." Jacques looked up at him, lips trembling, blood on his teeth. "Did we win?" Emile didn't know what to say. He looked at the sky, now filled with smoke and snow and sunlight, and he said, "We survived." The tanks didn't return. By the next morning, the air smelled of gunpowder and thawed earth. Smoke still rose from scattered buildings, but it no longer screamed. It drifted, slow, spent. Emile stood alone in the courtyard of the chapel. His hands were still stained with Jacques' blood. The forge behind him was cold now. The fire had served its purpose. British trucks rolled into Rochefort just after noon, olive-green monsters with red crosses and white stars. Medics, engineers, and a handful of grim-faced officers disembarked. The villagers gathered slowly, hesitantly, their faces etched with soot and questions. The commanding officer, Captain Lewis, was a tall man with a clipped accent and sharp eyes that scanned the wreckage with clinical interest. He saw the trail of tank treads. He saw the 5 blackened Panzer corpses, frozen in their death poses across the forest pass. And he saw Emile. "You," he said, stepping forward. "You're in charge?" Emile shook his head. "No one's in charge here." Lewis frowned. "Someone laid anti-tank devices on that road. Someone took out 5 of Hitler's finest machines without a single Allied weapon. That doesn't happen by accident." Emile said nothing. A second officer approached, holding the remains of one of the devices. Warped, scorched, but still recognizable. The plow blade was fused to the mine housing, twisted at the base, but unmistakably hand-forged. Lewis examined it. "This isn't ours." "No," the officer said. "It's not German either." He turned to Emile. "Where did this come from?" Emile met his gaze. "The ground." Louis didn't like riddles. He stepped closer. Who designed this? I did. That stopped him. You? What are you? Engineer? Demolitions expert? I'm a blacksmith. There was silence. A medic jogged past calling for more gauze. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried. A chicken wandered through the debris. Louis looked at the weapon again. You understand what this means? Emile said. It means they stopped. Louis studied him for a moment longer, then turned away. Get this to headquarters, he said to his aide. Every detail. The younger officer hesitated. Do we recognize the civilian? Louis didn't look back. There's no protocol for what to do with a blacksmith who invents battlefield tech. He walked off. Emile remained in the square, unmoving. No one clapped. No one saluted. But from a nearby doorway, an old woman stepped out and placed a fresh loaf of bread on the steps of his forge. A boy followed her, leaving a bundle of dry kindling. A few moments later, a third villager quietly swept debris from Emile's path. No one said a word, but they understood. Behind the chapel, Jacques lay on a stretcher, wrapped in thick blankets, his side bandaged tight. He was pale but breathing. When Emile approached, the boy smiled weakly. You lied, Jacques whispered. Emile raised an eyebrow. You said I wouldn't die. You didn't. Jacques chuckled, then winced. Guess I didn't. They sat in silence for a while. The village moved around them like a slow tide. Cleaning, rebuilding, mourning. Eventually Jacques looked at him again. They want to give you a medal, you know? The British guy said something about London. Commendation, some kind of recognition. Emile shook his head. Jacques frowned. Why not? Because medals rust. People forget. No, Emile said, eyes fixed on the forge. Because people remember the wrong things. The forge was quiet again. Weeks had passed. Snow had melted from the rooftops, leaving behind patches of muddy thaw and the smell of new earth. Children played again in the streets. The baker reopened. The church bell rang every Sunday, and the fires in the hills had gone out. Jacques recovered slowly. He walked with a limp now, a slight stiffness in his side that would never quite fade. But he smiled more. He helped rebuild rooftops, repaired carts, taught some of the younger boys how to shoot a rifle, just in case. He visited Emile every day, not because he had to, because he wanted to. On a gray morning, thick with spring fog, Jacques sat on a stool beside the forge, watching Emile work. The hammer was back in his hand, not as a weapon, but as a tool, shaping a horseshoe, gentle and exact. They wrote again, Jacques said, holding up a folded letter. From London? Jacques nodded. They want you to come, speak at some kind of conference. Show them how you made the blades. Emile didn't pause his work. You should go, Jacques added. Tell them what happened here. I already did, Emile said, still hammering. Jacques frowned. How? Emile nodded toward the wall. Hanging beside the door was the first broken blade, the one from the mine that flipped the second tank. Scorched, bent, its edges warped from the blast. Above it, a small wooden plaque. No names, no medals. Just a single word, carved by hand. Enough. Jacques read it again, then nodded. Emile quenched the horseshoe, wiped his hands, and sat down beside the boy. They don't need my story, he said. They have their own, their victories, their parades. Jacques leaned back. But what about your legacy? Emile looked around the forge, at the tools, the anvil, the dented door, the photos still resting by the cold rocking chair. This is my legacy, he said, fixing what others break. There was a long silence between them, not empty, but full. Then Jacques stood. You know, when I grow up, I think I want to build things too. Emile smirked. You're already grown. Then I guess I'd better start. He left with a wave, heading back toward the village. Emile remained seated for a while. Then slowly, he rose, walked to the far shelf, and pulled out a canvas-wrapped bundle. Inside was the last blade, the one he had never used, It was still sharp, still lethal. He turned it over in his hands, then walked outside. Behind the forge, beneath the apple tree where his son had been buried, Emile dug a hole. Not deep, just enough. He placed the blade inside, covered it with dirt, and pressed the soil flat with his hands. No monument, no stone, just silence, just steel returning to earth. He stood, brushed off his trousers, and walked back inside. The forge glowed behind him, and the world for now was at peace. Washington, D.C., 1999. The museum was quiet on weekday afternoons. School groups had already come and gone, and only a few solitary visitors lingered among the artifacts, some pausing before bullet-ridden helmets, others reading faded field reports behind glass. In the far wing of the War and Resistance exhibit, a small display case stood almost unnoticed. It held a single object, a curved slab of steel, charred at the edges, its surface rippled with blast damage. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Unknown anti-tank blade, origin Belgium, 1944, retrieved near Rochefort, exact make and engineer, unknown." A young boy, maybe 15, leaned closer. He had freckles, a Yankees cap, and the kind of curiosity that made docents nervous. "Why don't they know who made it?" he asked. An older man beside him smiled. "Because some stories don't come with names." The boy looked up. "You mean they lost the record?" The man, tall, silver-haired, with a slight limp, shook his head. "No, they never kept one." He stared at the blade for a long moment. "I was there," he said softly. The boy's eyes widened. "You were in the war?" The man nodded. "Not as a soldier, as a boy, in Belgium." He pointed to the blade. "That thing, it stopped a Panzer, maybe more." "Seriously?" The man nodded. "But it wasn't made by the army, not by engineers or generals. It was made in a forge behind a barn, by someone who had no medals, no rank, and no orders." The boy frowned. "Why would he do that?" The man's smile faded into something more distant. "Because he couldn't not do it." They stood in silence together. The boy glanced at the plaque again. "EVH," he read aloud. "That's carved right there at the bottom. Initials?" The old man's eyes glinted. "Yes," he said. "Yes, they are." The boy turned. "Do you know what it stands for?" The old man's hand brushed the glass just briefly. "Only everything," he said. Then he turned and walked away, his steps slow but certain. The boy remained, staring at the steel. He didn't understand all of it. Not yet. But something about it felt important. Not because of the shape, not because of the destruction it had caused, but because someone, somewhere, had put everything they had into it and never asked for anything back. And that, the boy thought, might be what real power looks like.